governed by authorial intent. In other ways, we were kind of coming full circle, and really our reconsideration included returning to some of the questions of the role of the author herself, particularly in Eric's essay about the role of Flannery O'Connor in the rise of creative writing workshops, which he'll talk about in a little bit here. And then also in Carol's essay, where she was considering Flannery O'Connor's wishes in terms of not only her literary estate, but also her material estate at the time of her death. So in some big ways, we were actually circling back to questions of authorial intent, maybe not the same ones that that we were in some ways hoping to kind of move past, but other ones. And so it was important for us to kind of find ways of reframing the collection, recognizing all that we've learned from the massive amount of excellent scholarship on O'Connor that does deal with authorial intent, but also wanting to kind of open up room for other voices and other approaches. So that was a little bit about the evolution. We finally settled on a shape for the book that really divides these reconsiderations into 4 sections. So the first section is new methodologies, where we're thinking about not only kind of how we apply theory to Flannery O'Connor, but how reading Flannery O'Connor can help us in some ways revise theory and kind of talk back to theory. So that's the first section, is the new methodologies. The second section is new contexts, which opens with Doug's essay on Gothic science fiction and Flannery O'Connor, and he'll talk a little bit about that too. In that section, we were interested in kind of considering her in contexts that aren't the typical ones for reading her work. The third section we ended up titling Strange Bedfellows, which is our loving way of naming that we wanted to consider Flannery O'Connor in conversation with writers who don't typically get considered alongside O'Connor. So that includes people like Nietzsche and Richard Wright and Sylvia Plath. I have an essay in there on O'Connor and Toni Morrison I can say a little bit about. And then the last section is O'Connor's legacy, which features those essays, the 2 that I named, Eric's and Carol's, that kind of reconsider her as a creative writer, and also as an intellectual property rights holder, and what her wishes were in that regard. So that's a little bit about kind of the shape and evolution of the collection. Yeah.
And I should say that when we did get that the feedback from the anonymous reviewers, it's not on. We suspect, and I guess we'll never know. We think one of them was Robert Brinkmeyer, but it really did change. We rewrote our entire introduction.
Yeah, we did.
It really changed kind of how we reframed it, and we even sort of the organization. It was great feedback, and I think it definitely made the collection stronger.
Should we shift gears to talk a bit
Yes.
with our contributors?
Yeah. So we've got some questions for our contributors, and since his essay appears first in the book, we thought we'd start with Doug Davis, because Doug, your approach using science fiction, looking at science fiction, it's sort of a unique approach among O'Connor scholars, and so I know you sort of have an interesting story, because I know you did a lot of work in Cold War studies and science fiction studies before you came to O'Connor. So if you don't mind just kind of telling us how that came to be.
Yeah, certainly. And partly it's because of Bruce Gentry, and but in my essay I talk about how O'Connor in a way is writing science fiction stories, and more specifically how she draws upon several science fiction ideas and imagery and tropes and plays with them in her own signature way. And this is, I think, the 6th essay I've published about what I like to call the technological O'Connor. And I don't know if there's too many other people writing about this. I didn't realize I was reconsidering Flannery O'Connor. I thought I was just considering Flannery O'Connor when I started writing about her about 10 years ago. And when I got a job in Georgia, I'm from New York. I'm not a Southerner, and I've always had a soft spot for Southern Gothic, and I knew of O'Connor from undergrad. I'd read one story, but Everything Rises Must Converge, and I loved it. It stuck in my mind, but that was it. And I got a job in Central Georgia at Gordon, which is not too far from Milledgeville, and at the time, that was about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer, I was driving through Central Georgia and I was lost, literally, deliberately too, because my wife and I used to like to go driving around Georgia and just get lost and drive on the little roads and visit the towns. And at the time, I'd been out of grad school for a while. I'd written a dissertation on nuclear war, and it was a depressing topic. And I was done with nuclear war and apocalypse. And I wanted to do something else. And I was thinking maybe I should do a Georgia writer and study her or him. I didn't know who. And then at that time, I just was randomly driving down a road but past Sinclair Dam and then heading south. And there's Milledgeville coming up and a little light went off in my head. And I was like, Milledgeville, that's where Flannery O'Connor's from. I remember that. And then all of a sudden I see the sign for Andalusia. And it's like, what, that's Flannery O'Connor's house. It's like, I know that. And so we turn off and we drive up that little pebble driveway, and there's Andalusia, and we get out, and I felt the power of the place. I mean, you know, anybody who reads O'Connor really has to go there and feel the presence there. And I bought the collected. I went in. I bought the collected works of O'Connor, started reading them, and I thought I was getting a new research line. I thought I was doing something literary. I got a job as an English professor, and I'm like, all the science and technology stuff, I want to do some literary studies. And I thought I was getting away from all that science and technology stuff, but I was just rediscovering it all over again in O'Connor, because I'm reading O'Connor and I'm seeing cyborgs and robots and science fiction. I'm like, I thought I was reading the Southern Gothic. So I wrote an essay about cyborgs and Ralph Ellison, and I sent it to Bruce at the Flannery O'Connor Review, and he rejected it. And but he sent back a very encouraging note, and he invited me to go to the first NEH, to apply to the NEH program, that the Summer Institute, the first one. And that, of course, everything changed after that. It's such a welcoming scholarly community, I gotta say. I see Carol there, who's in the audience, and hi, Carol, it's great to see you again. And it was such a wonderful time. Of course, you all know that too. Those of you who are at the second one, the camaraderie it can't be beaten. It's all the great parts of grad school and none of the stress, because you already have a job. And, yes. So but O'Connor has just been my muse. I like to say that O'Connor is my muse to the South, for better or for worse, but that's how I see Georgia. I wanted a writer who would teach me about my state that I'm living in now, that I've lived a good part of my life in now, and O'Connor has been it. And I've been pursuing this technological O'Connor trip for a while now, and I wrote an article about how she takes technological spaces and turns them into basically holy sites and cathedrals. I wrote an article about how Tom Shiflett in The Life You Save May Be Your Own falls in love and marries a car. And I wrote, when I discovered, as I was told at a conference in Milledgeville, I didn't realize that Flannery O'Connor has a real Cold War connection with her relatives. Her cousin Margaret Mann and her husband Robert Mann are pioneers in the field of cybernetics and digital computers. And basically, Flannery O'Connor's cousin built the first digital computer that had like RAM, the first use of RAM in it, up in Boston at MIT. So I realized there's a cybernetic connection here. I'm not crazy. This stuff is here, and it's part of her family history. So I had a fun time. I interviewed Louise Florencourt, and I interviewed Robert Mann Jr., Robert Mann's son and Margaret's son, and found all these cybernetic traces in O'Connor. And Bruce asked me to edit 2 special issues of a Flannery O'Connor review on science and technology and Flannery O'Connor, and I'm not the only one who saw that stuff. So I feel good for having started a little field here. I know Carol's one of the first O'Connor scholars ever, and there's something really special about being the first to something. And it's pretty great to be the first to O'Connor, but the first to do the technological O'Connor, I'm feeling good about myself too here. But it's all O'Connor. I was lost. I was in the woods, literally outside of Milledgeville, and then I was found. I was found by O'Connor, and then I was found by Bruce, and and then everybody else in the community of O'Connor scholars. So you're all the best, and I know. Hopefully you'll read my essay on O'Connor and science fiction and see some of the things that I see in there and not think that I'm totally crazy.
No, not at all. I think your essay is so delightful because of the way that it, at least for me as a reader, at first it seemed so unlikely. And then as I was reading, I'm just like, I'm persuaded. I'm totally persuaded, piece by piece. So I love that kind of surprise of like, I wouldn't have thought it. And then there it was the whole time. So
I jammed that thing out. And I remember calling Jordan and saying, I'm going to put a picture of a boot in my essay.
That's right. Thanks to Doug, our volume is not without images. So there are 2 pictures.
Frankenstein's monster's
People
boot.
who like books with pictures.
Which
We have
looks a
2
lot
of
like
them.
Yeah, I remember the first time I ever saw Doug give a paper, and he was using Carrie Wolf, and I remember it just being blown away. That he's sort of looking at this technological and science
I
fiction.
think that was the one about Tom Shiflett marrying a car.
Yes, it was. It was. Yeah, I love that, and I love in your essay in the book how you're using some of the pop culture of the time.
Mm-hmm.
You're also referencing Frankenstein, the amazing science fiction stories, and so it's you're pulling in a lot of other artifacts into it.
Yeah. I mean, I think John Lance Bacon paved the way there. We're looking at O'Connor and popular culture, and he published a great essay on O'Connor and gory comic books. And I'm like, well, if the gory comic books are in there, so are the science fiction pulps that would be on the same magazine rack right there. If you're downtown in the bookstore looking for just seeing things, it's there. So yeah, it's there's always, I feel like, reconsidering, it's like you can always reconsider an author. That's literature. You can keep reconsidering it. It's rich texts, keeps giving.
Jordan, do you have the next question?
Yeah, we can move on and go in order of the book. So that would be Eric. And Eric, most of us as lit scholars, we approach the text, based on our background or our training in literary studies. But you have the kind of unique ability of having attended O'Connor's alma mater of the Iowa Writers Workshop. So you also have that kind of creative writing approach as well. So could you tell us a little bit about how that sort of informs your scholarship and your attraction to O'Connor?
I think you're muted, Eric.
I think I'm having a unmute war.
We can hear you now. There we go.
Yeah. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Allie. It's so nice to see the familiar faces here and to be part of this project. In her opening remarks, Allie mercifully spared us from academic jargon in referring to O'Connor, those scholars who read O'Connor according to O'Connor. But helpfully in your guys' introduction, you distinguish between intentionalists and textualists. Intentionalists being scholars who take into consideration, in this case, O'Connor's own understanding of her meaning and using the ancillary materials that she wrote to help interpretation of her stories. Those intentionalists often, although not always, are Catholic readers who are very interested in the specific Catholic dimensions of O'Connor's writings. And they're distinct but overlapping with textualists who are much more willing to let go of what O'Connor thought she was doing and look at the texts as autonomous within themselves or intersecting with culture in ways beyond O'Connor's understanding. What's interesting about creative writers is they are intentionalists who really want to know what O'Connor was doing in her fiction, but are non-sectarian or secular intentionalists. So in general, it's my sense that creative writing programs bring together people who really are committed to the belief that an author means what she or he says. And to study other writers is to look for their intention in their writing and then borrow from that writing. So people do this a lot with O'Connor. They treat her texts as meant things that she carefully made and that can be imitated or learned from as carefully made meant things. But in my piece, I was interested in the way that people affiliated with creative writing programs misread O'Connor, even as they really embrace her as somebody who had intentions and whose intentions they can glean. I'll say just a little bit more to make it less abstract, and then I'll shut up. I've had the intentionalist reading that creative writers give to other authors within creative writing programs can happen on just a number of levels. So writers can learn from other writers just by getting close to the sentence. And so if Ernest Hemingway leaves the comma out between an adverbial phrase and the subject and verb, you do that too, and it sounds like Ernest Hemingway. Or if Faulkner puts adjectives after the noun in an apocalyptic high register kind of way, you do that too, and suddenly you're writing with that cadence. So at that close level, people engage with O'Connor for sure. I have friends who do craft talks pointing to her really succinct characterization. So a woman with a face that's as broad as and innocent as a cabbage that's just great. All of a sudden you have ethical and visual in a single pithy phrase, and you can learn from O'Connor in that way. So that's a kind of minute lesson from O'Connor. Creative writers can learn from other writers at a more medium register level. So not commas and adverbial phrases and quick metaphors. But how do you dramatize a story? Do you stick to one point of view? Do you use multiple points of view? Do you lean heavily on dialogue with no editorializing? All of that stuff is also something you can learn. You can write a Flannery O'Connor type story, assuming she meant to do what she was doing at the 20-page level. But then at the highest level, creative writers also presumably learn from the authors they study a philosophy or an outlook or some of the kind of higher dimensions of what fiction does. So you might learn from James Joyce or Vladimir Nabokov that everything can be made aesthetic, even ethically ugly things. Or you might learn from Henry James that point of view matters greatly. And so you choose your point of view carefully and you stick to it, and that the essence of the fiction is in that. And the thing that I observe in my piece is at that high level, creative writers tend to get Flannery O'Connor quite wrong. They will quote things she says about writing, about describing the world through the senses, or about experiencing mystery. Some of the kind of most famous tropes that she puts into her essays get detached from her essays as just kind of rules of thumb about how to write. And in that form, they just seem really out of touch with the work that she does as a religious thinker. And whether you're a religious thinker or not, it seems strange to put her at the center of so much creative writing pedagogy without kind of fundamentally understanding that dimension of her intention. So yeah, my essay is kind of about the botched intentionalism of creative writers trying to make use of O'Connor. No, you don't have to read it. That's it.
Is there more to say though too about what you think exactly the botch does? Like what would you say is the legacy of, maybe the mistaken legacy of Flannery O'Connor in the context of creative writing workshops?
She might have more legs than she would if people understood her. I mean, but I like how I think it's you, Ali, in the collection who mentioned that O'Connor seemed really amenable not to being misread, but to being engaged with in ways that weren't exactly faithful to some of the dogmatic heart of what she thought she was doing. So that'd be a more generous way of thinking about it, I think.
I think I was citing Bob Donahue when I made that point, so we should reference him too. But he does talk about how O'Connor was open to, I believe, what he calls like heathen or even misreadings for the sake of kind of furthering the work. So yeah, I think those are interesting points to consider, even as we grapple with the tensions of intentionalism and textualism. So yeah, thank you.
You know, it kind of strikes me at the beginning of around like the Napster era, Mike Borshak, who writes about jazz and Harlem Renaissance, but he was writing about how during the kind of the sampling age of like pulling off songs off an album, really you sort of miss the whole context. And he would reference all these like Miles Davis that would get pulled out of a larger piece, and now that's almost an antiquated notion, but that almost seems like what you're saying, Eric, is like just pulling these kind of pull quotes from O'Connor, you're missing a much bigger picture here.
Or no, I mean, this is an out of date illusion now, but I think just thinking of somebody like of Girl Talk, who mashes up pop songs in instantaneous proximity, and they make you immediately happy and then profoundly sad that you have Jay-Z and Cream just kind of interlapping. And I was actually thinking of that R.V. Castle, who was one of the main creative writer guys at Iowa, MFA and PhD, and the first president of the AWP. He wrote a kind of cultural studies essay about Sears Roebuck catalogs as this kind of Joycean artifact where everything is equalized. And I can't believe I'm talking about Joyce with Professor Shloss here, so I'll shut up. But no, that things mean differently if you're treating them as pastiche or kind of equalized by aesthetic presentation than they do if you treat them as embedded in a kind of deep history of ideas. And I do think O'Connor was writing within a deep history, even if she appropriated it in nutty ways.
Bruce says in the chat he'd like to hear from some of your friends about what you consider their good craft talks using O'Connor.
Oh, they're out. I'm sure there's great stuff. I'll send you a list of names.
Maybe this is a good moment to shift gears to Carol as well, who, as we've noted, was one of the very first scholars to write about the work of Flannery O'Connor. So Carol, we were interested in hearing about kind of the long arc that gives you in thinking about early considerations and also reconsiderations of Flannery O'Connor.
Oh, my whole life has been reconsidering Flannery O'Connor. I wrote about her when I was very, very young. And I wanted to write about her because very few people had done so. So I didn't have to wade through lots of criticism to get to my argument. I took as my starting point O'Connor's anxiety about her readers and that no one would get what she was doing. And I took that question seriously. What if you don't get what O'Connor is doing? What if you don't have that spiritual background? Are you going to come to the only readings that were then available to me, which made O'Connor out to be a Catholic writer from the South and made her symbolism and her allusions to come entirely within a Christian framework? So I took issue with that single-minded way of looking at O'Connor. And when I came back to O'Connor, and I have to say that Bruce is the one who pulled me back in, I came back and there were all of you, and there were lots of people writing about O'Connor, but it was in some ways a community that was in trouble. People were having trouble getting into print, but they were having trouble getting permissions. And I'm someone who likes to look behind the scene and to see who are the gatekeepers to the community. How do certain writers get access to O'Connor's work, whether it's published or unpublished? Who got kept out? So I just went back to the New York Public Library and to the Beinecke Library at Yale. And I started reading the letters of Robert Fitzgerald and Sally Fitzgerald and Robert Giroux and Elizabeth McKay to find out how they engineered an image of O'Connor. How did that early image that I had to struggle against get established in the first place? And I found out that there was a lot of muddle about who owned what and who could give permission to whom. Flannery had left all of her estate to her mother, but she made Robert Fitzgerald her gatekeeper. And so there were a lot of people kind of engineering how we could see O'Connor. It wasn't just a question of her intention. It was that people were given control of her as a piece of literary property. So in my essay, I went back and teased out who made the decisions, how they made them, who was left out, who was refused permission, just how was our community as a whole being somehow manipulated, and some people permitted to use O'Connor's work and some people weren't. And then I kind of made some speculations about how O'Connor might have regarded her fate, and found out that I think she would have disagreed with how her estate was handled. So that was the problem I wrestled with. How did we get to be a community with some people given voice and some people silenced?
And I love the way you connected some of these issues to her fiction themselves. You know, you're looking at like a circle in the fire, and drawing these connections, which I thought was just great.
Well, I was addressing the issue of poaching on land, and the circle in the fire is a story about somebody who owns property and is invaded by strangers. And I use that as a metaphor for Regina O'Connor, who owns the O'Connor estate, and O'Connor scholars who were seen to be encroaching on that estate. How did that management work? And in both the fiction and in life, there was somebody who felt that owning property meant that you could absolutely and without exception explain to other people how you could walk on the land or how you could use the property. So Regina O'Connor had a very definite idea of ownership, and sometimes Robert and Sally Fitzgerald worked with her, and sometimes they were the manipulators, the caretakers, the gatekeepers. So I tried to write an essay that would speak to a whole community of people who are writing about O'Connor because they love her, not because they own her.
That's very well said, and I think it's an important shift. I felt so honored that you trusted us with your essay in the collection, because it felt like such a firework that it was fun to have it as part of it. And I kept thinking, we got to get the book out soon because this firework can't sit here forever. So we just, but I felt that way actually about every contribution that you know, they're all in their own ways, I think, really doing that work of reconsidering and a lot of important reframing, which each from a different vantage point is kind of profound. So I think insofar as your essay, you know, advocates for the rights of scholars to have even more access to O'Connor in an unlimited way, it feels like a firework. So, but we have a question for you in the Q&A. Well, but I think we said or maybe we didn't say, but we meant to say that we're happy to entertain questions along the way. This one comes from Harriet Pollock. Harriet, would you like to read it, or shall I read it?
I'm unmuting myself right now. There you go.
Yeah, hi.
Hi. So
Hi.
I've been wondering if earlier estate censorship of the Marriott Lee letters in an odd sense created the recent controversy about O'Connor and race. That is, if the passages have been known all along, would there have been less sense of how scandalous they are? And so I started wondering, were there changes in the estate that caused permission to be granted now? And do you think that the development of the controversy will affect future permission requests, make them even more difficult?
Oh, well, that asked me to go beyond what I could find out in an archive.
Yeah.
But Marriott Lee was definitely refused permission to publish her letters. And they had to explain that even though she owned O'Connor's the letters in the sense of owning the pieces of paper, that she didn't own O'Connor's ideas. And she was just slammed. The door was shut in her face. So then you asked me to speculate about what would have happened had we known about the letters. That I don't really know. But you can actually trace one person after another being silenced. And so you can assume that that's going to build up tension and a sense of crisis when you're dealing with new material. So I guess I'm saying yes.
Yeah. Do we know why it is that suddenly the permission was available to publish these? Have there been changes in the estate? I'm not an O'Connor person. I'm a wealthy person, and I also deal with estate and permissions. And I know yours is even more fraught than mine. So I wondered if something happened that changed, that made it possible to publish those passages.
Well, I think maybe Bruce Gentry might be able to answer that question better than I can, because I don't know the answer to it.
Bruce, do you?
I can see that laugh.
Yeah, right. The O'Connor estate gave a bunch of money to Fordham so that Angela O'Donnell could start a book series. And then Angela makes the request, how about all these passages that haven't been published before? And the answer was yes. I guess there's a connection between those things. It occurs to me that we don't have a book we can put on the library shelf to say, you know, here's how you examine these passages in context. in any sort of context. You're gonna, for years probably now, we're gonna be going to those letters in the recent books that have come out. And, you know, there's gonna be one sentence here and one sentence here, and we're not even going to be able to see the whole letter. And I imagine it's going to be that way for a while. And of course, you know, someday we'll have the habit of being revised into a 25-volume shelf filler and libraries, and everything will be in context and fully quoted. I don't think it's going to happen right now. I think, you know, more people are telling me that they get permission for this and that than used to be the case. And I have no idea. I have no idea why. I never ask for permission. And I've just decided that I can live out the rest of my life without ever having permission to do anything. And, you know, let other people go through trying to do the things that require permission. So I never get much of a, you know, I did ask for permission one time, and I got it from the estate, actually. And then it turned out Harcourt was the problem. Harcourt wouldn't give me permission for stuff that the O'Connor estate would give me permission for. That was when we were trying to publish the index to the complete stories.
There's one thing that interested me about my research, and that is that Robert Fitzgerald and Robert Giroux never really understood what their role entails. Did they have power to make decisions, or were they working for Regina O'Connor? They never understood that. It's such a basic distinction. And so you have a group of people kind of writing letters of intrigue back and forth, but the roles were never clearly defined. Did ownership of O'Connor's paper, her ideas, her estate, give Regina O'Connor the right just to say what could be published? And if she didn't have that right, did Robert Fitzgerald have that right? In other words, did he have authority as well as a job to do? And no one ever cleared that up.
Right. And I have been sending people to you, Carol, for years saying, I don't know what's going on with, you know, legal rights. If you want to talk to the person who knows everything about the complications of O'Connor permissions, you know, from a legal standpoint, here's her email. I don't know how many questions I've gotten via email, but you know, I feel as if in Milledgeville we have less permission to do anything than anybody who lives outside of Milledgeville. That you know, we're at the center of the controlled version of O'Connor, and that distance, you know, creates legal or illegal freedom. And then there's the internet, which is you know, a source of endless chaos. And so I consider your answer to be the answer, and I realize that your answers tend to be complicated and nuanced and partial. And you know, that's where I usually stop, as I say, well, if Carol can't figure it out, it can't be figured out. You know?
And to kind of bring it back to Harriet's question, I can't remember if it was 2014 that the O'Connor estate sold a large collection of letters to Emory, but Monica Miller and myself and others, we were able to get in there before they even cataloged everything, and so then there were a lot of scholars that were able to see, you know, a lot of new or letters that had previously been unavailable. And so a lot of, there were definitely, Marriott Lee things that were known among the O'Connor community, even if we didn't have the ability to quote those.
Right, but it was Sally Fitzgerald who put a stop to that. It wasn't Regina O'Connor.
Mhm.
Because Fitzgeralds regarded her as a kind of property themselves. They didn't want any competition in their view of how O'Connor should be presented to the world. I mean, the letters that we have are highly edited. The published letters that we have are highly edited.
That connects to a question that came up in the chat. Was there ever talk about destroying the racist letters? Bruce or Carol, do you know about that?
I don't know.
No, I don't know anything. No.
Can I add to that was my question. I've seen in my own, looking through the archives and all, and looking at letters, sometimes letters seem to be missing, not there. And nothing to do with racism, actually having to do with homosexuality. And, one person writes something or somebody refers to something, and that letter's, I've never seen the letter, that sort of thing. And so I'm thinking maybe those letters were destroyed. And I was just wondering, since obviously Sally knew some of this stuff could not be let out, the racist stuff, that, if there was any, anybody thinking, oh, these just need to go, period. So.
Okay, well, I've read her letters, and I don't, her problem was our problem. Regina O'Connor wasn't letting anybody see any of the letters. So she was trying to get her hands on information. And there isn't any record of her destroying things. So I think she was in the same boat we are. She just couldn't get access.
Okay, maybe I should mention that it was back in 1994, I think, that the O'Connor conference here in Milledgeville had a big session, and I believe it was a keynote speech devoted to the revelation of the racism in the Marriott Lee letters, which were sitting here in this library. And I remember after the conference was over, Sarah Gordon basically ordered me to come back down here from Indianapolis for a few days to sit and read all of the letters, from the Marriott Lee group. And there's the racism. And I could see, anybody could figure out that here are bits that Sally Fitzgerald left out. I mean, some of the stuff that was in the New Yorker and in Angela's book, it's been sitting here for nearly 25 years. And it was there for us to talk about. And we could have, and for a variety of reasons, we left it to a few people. I mean, I didn't want to touch the subject of race for a long time, but it was there. We could have made it a much bigger deal than we did. There were still revelations to me from what Angela and the New Yorker article quoted from the letters that were released at Emory.
Well, and I was
back in Sullivan more recently.
on the idea of, O'Connor scholars and writing about race, Tim Crone had the book on race, and I believe he was a keynote speaker, I want to say in Michigan, at one of the O'Connor conferences. So, we've definitely had some scholars working on this topic.
When it's in the New Yorker.
Yeah, I know. I know.
But I mean, the interesting thing too about the New Yorker is that shortly after the O'Connor essay was published, there was another essay published on Faulkner
Right.
that I think made an argument about Faulkner that would be well applied to O'Connor too, which to me is a much smarter argument, which is to say that often the fiction of the writer reveals a lot more than the writer themselves, and that it's important to recognize that white supremacy has been the status quo and that we're all affected by it. So to make the question, this kind of question of to what degree was this person, I'm in no way interested in denying or giving excuses for anything O'Connor or anyone said. But I also think that if we make the measure of the contemporary worth of a writer a question of whether they have the mores of our present moment, we're completely misunderstanding the work of fiction. I think the useful thing about O'Connor, well, lots of useful things, but for me, one of the most interesting things about O'Connor is how I think that she indexes white attachment to power in ways that's greater even than a lot of her white liberal characters want it to be. It almost seems like, to me, one of the interesting things I found in thinking about how O'Connor depicts race is that you see that some of her white characters on some level want to not be racist and can't not be, that they themselves can't find the way out of it, that there's a kind of deeper attachment than they know what to do with, than they feel free admitting. And I think all of those things are useful and thought-provoking and challenging. And I think if we're just to say, oh, she doesn't have the frameworks of today, we should cancel her, we miss what she can teach us about white people grappling with what whiteness means and with what centuries of attachment to whiteness has done to white people. So I think it's important to recognize where she says racist stuff, because she does. I also think that it's important to listen to all the ways that she can help us be smart in thinking about race and power, and that the fiction in a lot of ways reveals more and offers more grounds for critical thinking than just those kind of the kind of shocking moments from the letters. So,
Well,
Ellie, you wrote about Morrison. How does Morrison tie in with that? Does Morrison?
Yeah, I mean, I think Morrison is really cool to put in conversation with Flannery O'Connor. Really, it was Beauty Bragg that got me thinking about that. She did an issue of the Flannery O'Connor Review on race and gender, and I remember being a grad student seeing the call for that, and I submitted an essay that was about gender, and Beauty Bragg wrote back to me and said, could you think more about whiteness? And this wasn't all that long ago, but I at the moment was so stumped as a scholar. I didn't even know how to kind of get my hands on whiteness, but Beauty Bragg's question was such a provocative one for me. I think she pointed out in her introduction to that issue that other than putting Flannery O'Connor in conversation with Alice Walker, which people have done fairly frequently, O'Connor is not often considered in conjunction with other Black writers. So I wanted to do a bit of that when I thought about Morrison and O'Connor together. My essay deals with how the two of them both write about figures in zoot suits, and the way that both Morrison and O'Connor write these kind of ghostly figures in zoot suits who other characters can't really even see. And I was interested in that, the inability to actually even see people wearing zoot suits, and kind of uncertainty and anxiety about what the zoot suit means and what it could mean. I wish I could say, I mean, in a lot of ways, I was challenged by Beauty Bragg's approach. I was also it was one of those lucky things that happens where you read the right books at the right time. I had taught Toni Morrison's Home in an African-American lit class I was teaching right before I did the NEH Institute. And I was struck by this figure of the zoot suiter, this kind of ghostly zoot suiter that haunts the veteran of the Korean War, who's the main character of Morrison's book. And then I read O'Connor's The Barber. And in that story, she has these zoot suited figures who show up not as a presence, but as an absence. O'Connor describes them as like a hole in the view. And I was like, what's going on? Why can't anyone see zoot suiters when they show up? It turns out Ralph Ellison also has a scene with kind of invisible zoot suiters in Invisible Man. So there's a lot to all of that. You can read my essay if you want to know more. But I think in some ways, it's just, you know, Rachel Watson's essay in the collection is another one. She puts Morrison in conversation with Richard Wright. There's a lot of important work to be done. And I think a richer vein, even than just the conversation of, you know, how racist was O'Connor, was she, wasn't she? I think that there is a trajectory in her work where we see her kind of grapple in deeper ways with her own racism and with attachments to it. So I think there's a lot there.
You know, I once had a conversation with a Salinger biographer who said, you know, that Salinger and O'Connor just seem to go together, seem to be speaking together. And it feels that way, you know, about Morrison. You know, it feels like there are these writers that naturally connect with O'Connor. And Morrison is one of those writers. So I was so excited to see you be able to connect Morrison and O'Connor.
Oh, thank you. It was fun to do, and there's a lot more to be said about it. So I hope it can just be kind of, you know, the beginning of longer conversations.
This
Yeah.
kind of, go ahead.
No, please.
This kind of seems to also tie in with what you wrote about too, Jordan, sort of the image of herself as an intellectual. I mean, clearly her intellectual identity was so important to O'Connor, but at the same time, she had to discount it, and sort of the function of her humor in her work and how that works.
Yeah, so I was definitely interested in Flannery O'Connor's treatment of intellectuals, especially when you go through her letters or you look at her biography and you realize, you know, she is an intellectual. You know, and sort of her intellectual development when she was at Iowa really interested me, especially the letters, the Emory letters. So I've been playing around with this topic for a while. I know Allie and Doug had seen me give a version of what's in here at SSSL years ago, and Tara Powell has a great book about Southern intellectuals, and so just kind of playing around with that idea of sort of, here's this intellectual, this who likes to really denigrate intellectuals and make them the butt of the joke, and just kind of exploring why is that, you know, why is it that she's so, you know, she's always kind of cutting. And so for this essay, it was like I'd been working on it for so long. It's one of the hardest ones to put together because I had, you know, so many pages. It, you know, at one point had kind of exploded to like 40 or 50 pages. And so cutting it back became hard, and there was a lot of, a lot to cut out, especially, you know, a lot of like Southern literary history of the intellectual that I ended up cutting to get, you know, more streamlined to the point. But yeah, it's just, it'd been a question that had really fascinated me, you know, why she's so attracted, and yet academics are always the punchlines. And I should mention that, you know, Doug mentioned not being a Southerner. I grew up in Missouri, which is like Mark Twain country. And Twain seems to do this a lot too, you know, have the, you know, the butt of the joke, you know, be these intellectuals. So I think that was something else that had really kind of attracted me to her.
You have a question in the comments too from Bruce Henderson. Does O'Connor make fun of intellectuals or of people who view themselves as intellectuals?
Ooh, yeah, that's a good question. Because, you know, one of the things I look at, Bruce, is kind of looking at, you know, it's not just intellectuals, but also artists as well, you know, that she kind of gives them all this treatment. But you're right. I mean, she does stick a mirror up. And so I think, you know, one of the things she's noticing is how serious intellectuals kind of take themselves. So yeah, I think you're right. I think it could be a lot of making fun of people who see themselves as intellectual and take that identity so seriously.
And then another comment from Harriet. I tend to think that the intellectuals she mocks are self-effacing versions of herself.
100%. Yes.
Agreed.
Yes,
Agreed.
definitely. Yeah, especially, you know, one of the things the prayer journal kind of showed, and a lot of the Iowa letters is you know, when she got to Iowa, she seemed pretty insecure, or, you know, just really nervous. And, you know, even that she does that kind of that playing in her letters where she's like, oh, I've never read it. And yet you see like what she's reading, who she's reading, you know, the kind of papers she's writing for classes. You know, they have some of her assignments at Emory. So, you know, she's definitely, you know, reading a lot of heavyweights, dealing with a lot of heavy, you know, but yet she just continues to kind of do the self-effacing thing.
Well, you know, we're sort of getting winding down. It's 8:10, but we still have a little time left. I added an extra half hour to this event. Bruce, you know, just as Doug Davis had added this concept of looking to the future with science fiction is not a way that people normally think of Flannery O'Connor. And this book, in essence, is doing the same thing, is saying there's a future here, but it's really different than what you might expect. And you kind of address that in your essay in there. What do you think is going to happen next? What's next?
Well, the Emory archive is probably, you know, the new can of worms that is going to get opened up. I mean, that's a gold mine. And let me tell you, I haven't read everything that's here in Milledgeville. And whenever I do go over to special collections and start reading more manuscripts, I say, why hasn't anybody ever talked about this stuff? You know, there's still a lot to discover, and I think a lot of it will be driven by just whatever new approach to literature comes along. It's you know, it's pretty reliable that whatever comes along, somebody's going to be able to apply it to O'Connor, and whatever she touches on, she deals with in a fairly complicated, unpredictable way. So you know, I do want people to keep trying to come up with new questions to ask, but I'm not worried about whether we're going to run out. So I think it's still possible for somebody like me in my position to just say, well, surprise me, come up with something brand new to say about Flannery O'Connor. And you know, I can be fairly confident that it'll work. The few times when I've told somebody, get out of here, you can't talk about Flannery O'Connor that way, I have been proven totally wrong. So, you know, I'm slowly learning here at the end of my career to be more open-minded than I already am. Yeah.
Since we have
things about the NEH Institutes was just sitting and talking to people about their projects, you know, one-on-one about, well, what are you up to? And over and over and over, I'd be trying to keep up with people who were bringing up stuff that I'd never thought of. And I'd try to act like I wasn't totally surprised, but that was the really thrilling part of that. And I'm sure that'll continue.
Since we have Bruce Henderson with us, Bruce, if you're willing, I'm sure everyone would love to hear a little bit about your essay too. I think your approach is another one of the kind of novel ones that the book has to offer, where perhaps some unlikely pairings happen. So I would love to hear if you're willing to share.
Sure, I don't have that much to say about it. For those of you who haven't looked at the volume yet, it's an essay doing what I'm borrowing from the disability studies scholar Carrie Sandel, a crypt queer reading that focuses principally on the river and Temple of the Holy Ghost. Sandel's use of crypt queer as one word is meant to point to intersectional identifications of both disability studies that does, following queer theory, uses crypt theory to suggest a kind of radical rethinking of terminology that has been used oppressively. What made me think of, I'm trying to think on the spot here a little bit. I think what was interesting for me about the 2014 NEH, which I was a part of, was I probably was the biggest outlier in a lot of ways entering into it. My field is performance studies, my principal field. So I minored in English. And then I went on to get additional training in disability studies, and I identify as a gay man, sometimes as a queer man. You know, I'm at an age where the tipping point of those terms are there. And so, you know, I come to O'Connor as, was it Judith Federley who talks about the resisting reader a little bit? I mean, I read my share of O'Connor in undergraduate and graduate school, but I often felt that, interestingly enough, Eric, when you talk about intentionalism, that I thought that O'Connor would not approve of me. I felt the same way about the subject of my dissertation, Marianne Moore. So I obviously am drawn to these spinster lady writers in some ways. And I use that term without meaning to be at all anti-feminist at all, but you know, where they sort of sit in that. I think it's interesting. I think part of what got me going was the week that Brad Gooch spent, because Gooch was first known as, you know, first of all, the most, you know, not knockout dead gorgeous model who was also a creative writer in the 80s, and then transformed himself into an academic and wrote, I think, a tremendously good book about Frank O'Hara. And sort of the question of why he was drawn to O'Connor. Well, he's writes about religion and spirituality, but also in talking with some of my fellow seminarians or institute members, there was the thinking that maybe he thought he was going to find a queer O'Connor. And then either to his dismay or just simply as a scholar, he learned that there wasn't necessarily that much in her biography to find. I mean, at least that's been revealed. And there may be letters that someone mentioned, and I'm sorry, Catherine, I think it was you who mentioned that there were letters about homosexuality that seemed to have been absent. So, but I decided, because I was raised as a good old new critic, you can show that I retired last year, that I just wanted to focus primarily on the stories themselves and what could be found there, because I wasn't going to be able to find, you know, a smoking gun or anything that, and I wasn't frankly all that interested, but I was interested in seeing what happens when you put these intersections of identities together, and does that produce any different kind of meaning? I also was one of the people who sort of identified as a non-believer. So it was like every reason you would say, what the hell are you doing going to a Flannery O'Connor Institute? Well, I've often found that when I'm resistant to something, it means that I need to investigate it more, and then I find something in it. That was certainly true with disability studies for me. So that led me, and actually became very productive for me in looking at principally at these two stories, just to see what I could mine in them, because they get me at a gut level. And then going back to sort of the intellectual approach made me think, when I raised my question about intellectual, Jordan, because I have a couple of friends who are would almost exclusively, I think in at least one case, define themselves as creative writers. One of them is a very successful, popular novelist who I went through high school and middle school with, who won the Penn Hemingway Award and such, but she was not raised in the academy. In fact, she was turned down by Iowa for the MFA program. But she goes back to her alma mater, Carleton College, from time to time to teach. And her letters about living among the academics are hysterical. I mean, not disrespectful, but it is like a different world for her to be among people who are not producing the literature, but people who are taking it apart. And when I've asked her questions about some of her stories or her novels, I mean, I get the equivalent of sort of a blank stare, like, well, I didn't think of it that way. But feel free to go ahead and think of it, you know, whatever way is useful. So I wonder if people who are primarily creative writers sort of look askance at intellectuals as if, you know, not necessarily denigrating what we're doing, because they, you know, appreciate the attention we pay to their work, certainly, but that they really do look at us as different species. And that's why I raised the question of an intellectual versus a, you know, a faux intellectual, or what the Marquis of Queensberry would have said, posing as an intellectual or whatever. I suspect that O'Connor had a lot of respect for people she truly deemed intellectuals, but probably less so for, the peacocks who could trot out all the theory and basically not get the heart of what she's doing. I wanted also to raise one of the, and I'm sorry I'm going on, but this is pent up from all the things you're talking about. When we're talking about the language and the racism and all of that, my primary courses were in the performance of literature, what used to be called oral interpretation. And I would always do a unit on group performance where I'd give the students a story and say, okay, as a group of 4, group of 5, take this segment of the story and figure out a way to stage it using the narration. And my last semester teaching, which was fall 2020, I missed the beginning of the coronavirus by just that much. I decided, because of the state of our country, to give the students the displaced person. It seemed to me to have a particular resonance. And the students did some wonderful work with it and loved it. And I did have some students of color in there, not a lot, but more than just one, which is a step up with it, like a college. And of course, there's that moment, where the displaced person is being told not to muck around with, or try to influence. What is our lady's name? I'm just blanking. Mrs. the owner of the farm.
Is it McIntyre?
Yes, and she uses what we now call the N-word. And one of the students who was in the group, as it happened, was a very bright young Black man. And he came and he talked. He did not disparage the quality of writing or the story. He just felt that uttering the word was beyond what any of the students felt comfortable doing, even in the dramatic context. Now, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have said, no, you have to be faithful to that text and say the word. I didn't. I decided that language has changed to the point where it was so loaded that they would miss what is really valuable and useful about the story if I made it about uttering that word. So that's where the rubber sort of hit the road for me about, because I remember during 2014, the speaker who talked about the artificial story and went out of her way to be very respectful, utter the word, but put quotation marks around it and all of that so that we would know that she was citing it rather than uttering it. And at the time I thought, oh, say the word, we're all adults here. Well, I'm not sure I would these days. So the question of what we do with the writer in our time, for the general reader, I think that's a hard one. We were speculating about whether you could actually, in 10 years, would we still be teaching Flannery O'Connor? Would we feel that we could in our classrooms? Sorry, that went way off in 5 different directions, but it was an incredibly rich summer, I have to say, the NEH summer, and it's still living with me. I'm trying to figure out what it means to read Flannery O'Connor as an agnostic or atheist, in sort of response to Bob Donahue's call for papers on, do we have to read Flannery O'Connor as through theology? Well, I never do. I don't read her through, I mean, I'm aware of it, but I don't read it through her theology. That's not what gives me whatever I get from her, any more than I would feel the need to be a Buddhist to read Siddhartha, which is probably not a good equivalence since that was written by a German person.
So Bruce, one thing, when I was in graduate school, I was also taking courses in religious studies, and I was, looking at O'Connor, how she's reading the Bible, and so kind of like in that headspace.
Right.
And then I see Doug Davis talking about her as a machine, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is such a different way of thinking about her. And I remember like being a graduate student and like going and bothering Doug, and then like calling him a few times to talk to him about his paper. But that's what I remember him telling me that, O'Connor's a big tent party. And that's honestly, that's in terms of the critical community, that's what's really interested me. That's why I've kind of kept going to that well. And even like, we all have friends and, studying different authors. And I think that's one thing that's kept the O'Connor scholarship pretty strong is that we are broad. There's a lot of room for a lot of different interpretation.
And maybe that's a good place to open it up if there are other
Yeah.
questions too, since we've kind of got
I'll
a lot
mute
on the
myself.
table. Yeah.
I just wanted to say about O'Connor in relation to Mariette Lee. I think O'Connor at some point, especially returning to Milledgeville, made the decision to go tribal. She really embraces that, and you see it in her letter to James Baldwin. Not her letter to James Baldwin, her letter to Mariette Lee about James Baldwin, but that she really sees the limitations in progressive thinking about race. And if you study Mariette Lee's life, she had a lot of failures around racism herself. And I think that's what makes O'Connor the perfect writer to be reading now. And that part of her tribalism would be to give a title to a story, The Artificial Nigger. She doesn't want to, ignore the language of her people, but that kind of documentation of white people at the time, racism of white people, is so important. That's one reason it's so important to study her. I've written about this. I teach at a school that is largely students of color, and I had colleagues say that you should never teach her here, but I've had some really meaningful teaching experiences, and especially when the and I was thinking of Bruce because we do a lot of performance of her dialogues, and a lot of cross-race, cross-gender casting. So the one experience that I wrote about that just stands out in my mind is a Black student who took on the role of Mr. Head, and he really hammed it up. And it was through having us all in hysterics, but it's kind of through that exaggeratedness of taking on that role that we had some really interesting conversations. And he had the choice. It was a semester where I was pairing O'Connor stories with James Baldwin stories and also essays. They really line up chronologically too. He really wanted to write on Sonny's Blues, James Baldwin, but he said that he just had to write on The Artificial Nigger because he hated so much what Mr. Head was doing to Nelson. And he wanted to intervene. And I just found that to be like a very powerful action of a Black student wanting to write as an intervention of this white child character being taught racism. So I like the fact that she doesn't shy away from the kind of brutality of racism and the gentility. I mean, and someone like Mariette Lee, I feel like people talk about Mariette Lee as if the contrast is that Mariette Lee was the progressive one on race, but she just made some real stumbles herself. And I think that what's more interesting in thinking about their relationship is how they were both struggling, and they came at it from very different angles. But I don't see that they're necessarily foils for each other.
Well, I teach at an HBU, and I've been teaching O'Connor's work at the HBU, I want to say for like maybe the past 10, longer than that, maybe 15 years. And the course I currently teach, though not this year, is a course that I teach with a theology professor. And so the whole idea is we approach O'Connor first through as literature and then as theology. And we have both noticed, and I've noticed from teaching it before I was teaching with him, it is getting harder and harder at an HBU to teach O'Connor. It used to be most of the students would be okay with the N-word, and they could get through to what was really happening in O'Connor's and O'Connor's work. And I would have the occasional one or two students who would get very upset and understood. To the point where it's more and more the other way around. And I've had to deal with students saying, why is it I'm coming to an HBU and I have to read this work? I have to hear this word. Why am I having to read this? We understand racism. So Mark, the guy I teach it with, and I have talked about it, and we definitely put it on hold for this semester, but we both have talked about how the level of stress teaching her work, because despite everything else that's happening, and you can imagine, since I'm handling the literature, all the different venues I get to, I mean, different ideas I get to toss around and all, it's wonderful. And you can't ignore the racism on O'Connor and just teach the few stories that don't have it in there, without really, shortchanging the students and really misrepresenting the what all O'Connor's work takes on. But we have both talked about we need to maybe reconsider how we approach her, and that we really need to wait. Can I say that it's gotten worse in the past 4 years? Absolutely. Absolutely. It's almost like a little line right there. But, I think there's a lot from O'Connor as far as racism is concerned that white people can definitely learn from. But the Black people are telling me, we already know this.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for sharing. I think it is right to kind of think about how, who's served by the text we approach and how. So that's crucial. Thank you.
It's difficult. It's difficult.
It's interesting because the classes, I haven't taught her for maybe a couple of years. And I feel like since the summer, George Floyd and the protests, it feels like a changed universe in a way. So that's really interesting what you bring up.
Well, thank you, everybody. This has been an incredibly rich discussion, and I'm sure we're all going to go away and be still thinking about it. But I think I leave, just as Bruce Gentry put in the chat, that he's very thankful for the book and for all the originality being brought to O'Connor's studies. So thank you, everyone.
Yes, thanks for coming tonight, everyone. So nice to
Thanks
hear
so
from
much.
you all,
Thank you.
meet with you all. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for putting the book together, Allie.
And Jordan too. Yes, well, a great pleasure. Thanks for trusting us with your great essays. It's been an honor, and may it be productive of many more good and thoughtful conversations.
We'll look
Good.
forward to that. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
See
Thank you.
you all.
Bye. Thank you.
Look for our schedule for next year.
Thank you, Irene, for all the work in organizing the conversation tonight.
Thank you,
Oh.
Irene. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Alan. Thank you, Eric.
That was fun.
It is fun, isn't it?
Yeah, it's been
Bruce gets a blast out of it, don't you?
I think you're muted, Bruce. I don't want to miss it.
No, I'm just saying I was having a very good time.
Oh,
Yeah.
It was fun. This is old home. Yeah.
Good, good.
Yeah, it's good to see faces. It's good to see I'm not the only person who's getting older around here.
What?
I've got all my.
Except you, of course. Okay, y'all keep writing essays.
Thank you.
You're sending them to Bruce.
Every once in a while.
Bye.
Good to see your face.
Bye.
All right.
Take care. Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Good night.